He's nice enough to cover for me today. If it had been me, we wouldn't even be seeing each other on screen, probably.
And when we switch to the Q&A period, we're probably going to bring them up in the grid so we can see everybody.
Ojo's volume just dropped.
Just as a welcome, a brief welcome to Atlanta Soto Zen Center Sunday morning. This is the 5th Sunday of the month, which happens 4 times a year. And so we do Dharma combat. Hossen is extended. Mando means something like crossing of swords. We understand that this technique or format was developed when one Zen master in China, I think, had 5,000 followers, and they all lived in the monastery, at the monastery grounds. So the only way they could expose everyone to this teacher was to do something public like this, and they would trot him out, put him up on the dais, and people one at a time would step forward and raise a question based on the teachings or based on their understanding, testing their own understanding. This kind of thing was extended into what it was called pilgrimage, or an amusing translation, the tiptoes of training, meaning going from teacher to teacher around the country. In Japan, you could, of course, walk from one end of the country to the other without too much trouble, or ride a donkey. And so amongst the various skillful means, pedagogies are developing the propagation of Zen, even in its countries of origin, as these kinds of techniques or formats, public exchanges were developed. Dokusan is a private version of this, where an individual student comes into the Dokusan room or chamber and brings up issues, and the teacher responds. And I always understood that to be more characteristic of Rinzai training, where you have a systematic series of koans to assign the student, and they come up with answers, and they're required actually to come up with an answer. So the main point I want to make with this introduction is Zen is not a spectator sport. When you practice Zen, and I think the easy way to remember it is the onus is on us. You are not expected or required to do any of these things in lay practice, householder practice, but you're encouraged to do so. So when you come to Dharma combat in particular, it's a good idea to have a notepad and a pen and so on, make notes. It's a good idea to come prepared to ask a question that's been troubling you for some time, something that doesn't make any sense and yet may be an integral part of the teaching as far as you understand. And it's your opportunity to get the old guy like me, who theoretically has some kind of experience, to respond in some way that hopefully is clarifying. So with that in mind, we will launch into the exchange. And I'm going to quote you a koan from Shobo Genzo. It's at the end of the chant. Shobo Genzo, not the Shobo Genzo, Genjo koan means something like actualizing the fundamental point. The koan realized the difference, main difference that Matsuoka Roshi would stress between Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen is in Soto Zen we regard sitting in Zazen as the Genjo koan. It is the koan of everyday life. It is the koan actualized or realized, hopefully, eventually. And we don't need another stinking koan pile on top of it. And so we typically, in Rinzai practice, my understanding is that their meditation is a contemplation of the koans that they have been assigned, which for us is a little bit like a head upon a head. It's something extra or superfluous. You're already sitting in the major koan of everyday life, existence itself. So another koan assigned to you would be extraneous or superfluous. But in the pedagogy, in the context of a koan Rinzai teacher who's trained in this and knows how to do this and knows how to select a koan for you and then how to help you work your way through that and then how to assign the next koan for you. For some personality types, this would be highly appropriate. But because we're not trained in it, we do not try to do that. So our discussion today is not like that. It's more like you bring the koan of your everyday life, and I do my best to respond to it from my perspective of experience in Zen. And I am not the best teacher for anyone, but you know, it may have some benefit for you. If you truly find that the teacher you're following doesn't seem to know what they're talking about, or is just confusing the issues for you, it's a good idea to go find another teacher and not waste too much time. But you should not look for a teacher that you agree with. A true teacher in Zen is considered somebody who has some experience, and they base their response and their view and their approach on their experience, not on the fact that they've been authorized or have a certificate to hang on the wall. It's not like that. So an affinity between you and your teacher does not mean that you necessarily agree with what they have to say or that they would agree with your understanding. And in fact, their job is to get out of your way and to try to help you reach at least the same level of insight, if you will, or the same level of grasp of Buddha Dharma that they have. And in a sense, once that occurs, they've done their job, and so forth. So I use the coaching metaphor, the coaching analog. If the athlete is willing to do the work, some coaching can help. If the athlete is not willing to do the work, no amount of coaching is going to help. So I think Zen teachers are in that kind of category. They're kind of like a coach or an online consultant for you to come to once in a while. So these exchanges that people had over the centuries in this format are similar formats. Were typically recorded, as it turns out. Somebody's sitting there with a pile of rice paper and a brush and ink, I guess, and documented a lot of these. And they became the classical collection of koans, which amounted to something like 1,700 koans. And Hakuin, amongst others, some of you are familiar with Hakuin Zenji, I think 18th century Rinzai master, highly revered in Soto Zen because of his appreciation and promotion of Zazen. And in many koan circles, I understand, and the Ungan on tonight is the only one I know for sure who's had some Rinzai training, so he may want to say something about this. Koan training was often regarded as the prerequisite for Zazen in those circles. So it was a way of working through your mental confusion and abstract ideas, intellectual understanding, and getting down to a more basic level where you could approach Zazen as the koan of everyday life. So in many ways, these so-called differences between Rinzai and Soto are, like most differences in public life, were made up for political advantage or, to distinguish our school from the other school, etc. So any questions so far, or comment? Okay, so toward the end of the Genjo koan, Dogen has gone through a very abstract description of what it's like to have realization, and says some remarkable things in there. But then he goes to an example which is typical Dogen. He says, Zen Master Baoshe was fanning himself. A monk approached and said, Master, the nature of the wind is permanent, and there is no place that it does not reach. Why then do you fan yourself? Although you understand the nature of the wind is permanent, Baoshe replied, you do not understand the meaning of its reaching everywhere. What is the meaning of its reaching everywhere? Asked the monk again. The master just kept fanning himself, and the monk bowed deeply. Now Dogen goes on to comment on this, and if you have any questions about that, that would be appropriate during this session as well. He says, the actualization of the Buddha Dharma, the vital path of its true transmission is like this. If you say you do not need to fan yourself because the nature of the wind is permanent, and you can have wind without fanning, you will understand neither permanence nor the nature of wind. The nature of the wind is permanent. And because of that, the wind of Buddha's house brings forth the gold of the earth and makes fragrant the cream of the long river. So this is the tail end of Genjo Koan, which in our poetry reading February 13th, I mean to recite in total, from beginning to end. So you might want to tune in for the poetry reading if you're not aware of that yet, and offer a poem. So with that, I'm going to start with Brian here. He's close enough that I can give him 30 blows, if need be, and ask him to raise a question. So we simply make a bow from where you are, if you will. Chishiki. And for those of you who don't know, Chi is chair of our board, and he is the owner of the retreat center in Hayesville, North Carolina, or outside of Hayesville, North Carolina. Been a long-time practitioner, former resident. So I think for your question, you can remove your mask.
I probably need the 30 blows before I ask the question.
All right.
When he's talking about the wind reaching everywhere, it seems like maybe that's might be a metaphor for Buddha nature, kind of maybe a question. I don't know. I'm sort of reminded of kind of the practice question, which is if we all have Buddha nature, then why do we need to practice? And I don't know if they're related or not, but they seem related to me. And if they aren't related, it's a good question anyway.
Yeah.
And to extend that a little bit and to ask maybe a longer question about practice, and maybe I'm bending this a little bit to the question that I did have in mind, but it seems like craving and aversion bring us to practice. And there's a lot of talk of sincerity.
Say that again, creating an aversion.
It seems like there's a lot of craving and aversion that brings people to Zen practice.
Craving and aversion.
Right. They're trying to get away from something, or they're trying to get something from Zen practice. And it seems like a lot of times we discuss sincerity with regard to practice, that people should approach their practice with sincerity. With all of that said, if craving and aversion start to drop away, how does sincerity apply, and where is the impetus for practice? So it kind of, again, like the fanning. Why would you fan yourself if the wind reached everywhere? And kind of along the same lines.
Yeah,
what motivates practice once the original reasons for coming start to fade away?
Right.
Which is kind of a different question, I guess, but I'll start there for something you can riff on, maybe.
Well, I think it was Dogen's dilemma to begin with. If we are innately enlightened, why do we have to do anything about it? Why is it so hard? And of course, the answer in Buddhism is ignorance. We are so mired in confusion and ignorance, our own view, our own opinions, our own idea of Zen or Buddhism, that it takes a long time to get free of that and get down to something very basic. This is where Soto has a rap on koan practice because it seems to just add another layer of such intellectualization on top of reality. So if your initial motivation for practice is answered in some wise or in some way becomes less of an issue, you're no longer as maybe as driven and crazy as you were, and so you feel like you're getting someplace. The very sense that you have an accomplishment becomes the motivation for practice. Just as if you satisfactorily answer a koan to a Rinzai teacher, his or her response is to give you another koan. And so out of the 1,700, I think Hakuin classified them in 5 different groups, for basically for newcomers and more intermediate and advanced and so forth. Not a hard and fast division. So that from the teacher's intuition with where this student is at and their progression, they could give you the next assignment. And it would be similar to teaching music or anything else. Once a person gets to a certain level of accomplishment, you're going to take them up to the next grade level. Like in, remember the beginning primers in piano were very simple, and then the next one's got a little harder and a little harder. So I think the koan training is a little bit like that, but if you relate that to our Soto practice, you can see it has to be as well. If you penetrate to a certain point where you're pretty happy with your practice and you seem to have overcome the initial layer of difficulty going in, the next difficulty is you become complacent, thinking that you've achieved something. So somebody said there are 3 major barriers in Zen. The first is physical comfort. It's not very comfortable to sit in Zazen for most people. And overcoming that is the first barrier. And once you're over that, it's kind of smooth sailing, but then you start to fall asleep. So sleep becomes the second barrier in Zazen itself. What the third barrier is, I will leave up to you to determine once you've overcome sleep. So the wind reaching everywhere means whether you know it or not, I think this is already true. What you're looking for is already here, present. That the wind is permanent, what does that mean, do you think? Anyone? The nature of the wind is permanent.
To me, it sounds like the breath, that it's the wind of Buddhist, the breath.
Buddha was said to have said that there is impermanence means that there is permanence. And his monks are very glad to hear that.
It defines itself, right? So permanence and impermanence define each other. So of course it's permanent, right? If the wind exists, it's permanent because permanence and impermanence define each other.
It's a koan.
So the answer is just hit me 30 times.
Anybody want to offer anything on that?
Joseph was making a comment.
Yeah, I don't know how well you guys can hear us, but I definitely was thinking about the nature of the wind and impermanence and whether that connects up with the breath. We talked about the wind at Buddha's house, which, I mean, it's in the abode of the abodes of the inspired, where higher thoughts and achievements can, be formulated and held in our mind. I don't know, like breath is this thing that's permanent as long as you're alive. It pervades everything. It's your body and it's your mind and it's the way that they're connected. And I don't know. As long as your brain is being oxygenated, the reality constructing apparatus of consciousness is going to be present, and it's going to be, you're going to be in its stream of, inciting incidents. Yeah.
So interesting and appropriate that you went right to the inner model, if you will, or the inner dimension of wind. And all of the elements are understood that way in Buddhism: earth, wind, fire, water. They add space. What else? Consciousness. These are considered fundamental elements. But they're understood to be neither exclusively inside or outside. So there's wind and water, earth, fire, inside our biology or inside our bodies, just as much as there is outside. When you look at the wind outside, then you look at what we're dealing with now with climate change. But you also have the solar wind, and you have all kinds of variations on what is meant by wind. It typically symbolizes movement. And as you're saying, movement is a characteristic of life itself. If there were no movement, there could not be life.
I
But
think
we end up on
Justin
the
had his
horns of
hand
another
raised.
dilemma, mokurai. Stillness in motion, motion in stillness. Both movement and stillness disappear. You give me 30 blows. How about in the room here? Do we have somebody? Do you have a mic? Mic. Come. The formal way, by the way, is people step forward and make a bow and stay here until they're satisfied with the answer, and then they say, "Thank you for your teaching." They return to their seat. And anybody at any time can say unclear, unclear, meaning please explain that a little better or more. So we're being very informal about this.
My mom is from Japan, so I was thinking about cross cultures yesterday, and the Japanese tend to, in my opinion, they have relationships based on what they think is creativity. I think it's based on respect, and then people in America tend to have relationships based on respect, but they seem to, on the surface, maybe they think it's about creativity. Hey, let's go do this. Hey, let's go. The more I think about it, that it just made sense to me last night. I don't know if you guys can agree, but it seems pretty. To me, it seems pretty, I guess, obvious.
So say that again about the Japanese versus, are you speaking of the Japanese mindset versus the Western mindset?
Yes, and then the fuel that's needed for both types of relationships between cross cultures.
And what's your comment or question on this particular occasion?
What Japanese people need.
You said they see space differently? Is that what you said?
Yes, I mean the film culture there is more anime and replay,
Right?
and they don't have the film culture that we have here at all. But it's really detailed cartoons. I guess that I don't know. I think maybe I'm not articulating it well. They don't have a film culture. They have more of an anime culture there.
Mm-hmm.
No matter, and the anime just gets better and better and better, a little bit better. That's about it. And so I think that adds to my original question.
Would you like to take a shot at that, Chief?
Trying to bring it back to the question. Can you bring it back to kind of the question about the wind and permanence, and can you tie that in somehow, maybe?
The wind. I mean, maybe what like maybe different gusts of wind are needed for different ships. That's the only thing I can really think of. That kind of maybe a bit. I can't think of anything for that.
Well, certainly difference in cultural difference in
Different and simple stuff. I don't know.
the nowadays we would say the master just kept the air conditioning on. He wouldn't be fanning himself in the first place, right? In our culture, at least. But many differences between Asian mindset in general, Western mindset. Matsuo Roshi would talk about this in his writings, and they were about bridging East and West, where they're fundamentally not really irretrievably different, but the Eastern mindset is sometimes expressed as more geometric, and the Western mindset is more algebraic in the sense of linear and cause and effect. This leads to that, leads to this, leads to that, etc. And the geometric would be the simultaneous interactions of causes and conditions upon each other is a more complex way of looking at it. But Western science is obviously coming to some of these same conclusions. I see, again, we have Carola Butler on tonight, so you can speak from a more scientific perspective. But yeah, I think there are certainly cultural differences, but they're not fundamental, according to Matsuoka's interpretation, at least. Are those online questions? Is that chat? Oh, okay. Why don't you read them? I can't read them from here if we want to answer those. Oh, okay. If you can have, let's go to the expression, if you say you do not need to fan yourself because the nature of the wind is permanent, and you can have wind without fanning, you'll understand neither permanence nor the nature of wind. So I think it's pretty clear, but what do you suppose he means, this attitude that you can have wind without fanning? And I think it goes back to Chi's original question, Brian's original question. You can have wind without fanning, if you think that. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Michael. It's nice to meet everyone this morning. But I was thinking about kind of what you just asked. Why do you need to fan yourself?
A little bit louder, please.
All right, can you guys hear me now? Is this good volume? Oh, okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Gotcha. But I was thinking about what you said about why you need to fan yourself, and it made me think of kind of a talk we had before about why we practice, why we do sit. If we are already enlightened, if the Dharma is already with us, if we don't need to reach it. And it made me think back to kind of the answer that was given about insight, about how fanning yourself might be compared to getting that insight and being able to apply the discernment or insight to the actual nature of the wind itself, or the actual nature of Buddha nature, or of the teachings. And kind of connected to that, we talked a little about sincerity in practice. And my question related to that is, in practice, in fanning yourself, in trying to understand, to try to have this insight, or to gain this insight to the teachings, where does striving play its role in practice, as opposed to complete sincerity without striving, or complete striving without any sincerity? Where does striving kind of fit into that?
Right. There's one of the lines from one of the Chinese poems says, when for the unified mind, in accord with the way, all self-centered striving ceases. So you would have to probably classify striving as two kinds. One is self-centered striving, but another is, you'd have to say, well, is striving for awakening, striving for enlightenment, is that self-centered? And according to Buddhism, you may approach it that way, but it's not going to work. Master Dogen, in his establishment of the Bodhi mind, ASZC, he says, he claims that there is no establishment of the Bodhi mind without the Bodhisattva vow to help all other beings. The two are commingled, they cannot be separated. And so you can imagine that you're accomplishing something for yourself, sitting on the cushion, but that's all it is imagination. So the motive, or the initial motives that Chi mentions for sitting, we want to get over our frustration, we want to overcome, we want to be calmer, we want to be more productive, we want to be happier, etc., etc. You could call all of that self-centered striving, the initial reasons why anyone would take up Zen practice. And all you have to do is attend some newcomer sessions. In the interview part, most people will tell you that's why they're here. They came here because they're going through some sort of crisis, or at least they see one coming, and they're trying to get themselves straight so that they can, do better. And you can consider all of that self-centered. Others may have altruistic motives where they're very engaged in charitable activities and so forth, and they want to be more compassionate, find themselves becoming angry with the very people they're trying to help, and so forth. We have all those kinds of situations developing, especially with the pressures we're under now. But there's a point at which you would have to say that your reason for sitting Zazen transcends the kind of self-centered striving and becomes something else. The self is still included. It's like the way we think of it is, the same poem says something like, in this world of suchness, there's neither self nor other than self. So if you come to that kind of integration, you can see your activities necessarily have to be selfish, self-centered, because that's what you are and who you are. But at the same time, they can be for the benefit of others. So they can both be selfish and selfless, or neither selfish nor selfless at the same time. Both can be true at the same time. So most of this is resetting our frame of mind to approach our practice in a way that is non-dualistic. But, we experience the vacillation into both sides of it over and over, and the vacillation is part of the process. That's the most difficult thing to get used to, is that we're all bipolar. We all go high and we go low, and we go, between extremes all the time. And that's the nature of the process. The idea, I think, is that, like most people will say, they come to the Zen center and they're on their best behavior. They go home and they're the same jerk they were before, or at work. And so the contrast between those two different selves becomes pronounced. So they can understand why I can be so great at the Zen Center and be accommodating and, have concern for the others and so forth. And then I get back into my driving on the expressway going home and some jerk cuts me off and I'm right back where I was. But that vacillation, you don't have one extreme without the other. And so the line that says, great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. In other words, we don't prefer to be always calmly serene and then on top of things. I mean, of course we do. I mean, it's a lot easier. But we have to develop a lack of preference for when we go off the deep end and we go nuts over here on this end. That is what complements the other end. As a psychiatrist, I think Brian could probably speak to that vacillation better than I can.
I do wonder, ask a question, Sensei. Kind of back to the wind comment. I was thinking about that. I don't know about knowing more because I'm a psychiatrist about anything you just said, because I probably don't. But I don't know anything about the wind thing either. But I would like to say, I'm kind of curious when he's fanning himself in this koan, if he's really talking about kind of the wind element based on that point in time, or whether he's actually talking about the wind that's created, like the actual feeling of wind. And we talked a little bit about kind of the great way is not difficult if there are no preferences. And it seems like the monk was trying to point out that the master had a preference for being cool, that he had a preference for this. And then the master, but he said basically the wind pervades everything. And by that, I think he probably means the air element pervades everything. He doesn't mean the wind pervades everything, because the wind isn't perceptible when it's not blowing, which is the part that defines the wind, right? So if the wind isn't blowing, that's how you even know there is wind. Because if the wind were blowing consistently all the time, we wouldn't even call it wind. It would just be what it is, right? So it's like these opposites sort of define each other, right? So hot and cold, and
But I think it's
light and dark, and
I don't think he's pointing at air so much. The motion of water flowing is like also the wind. The planet circling the sun is wind. Any movement at all is wind, is a form of wind. And everybody knows the wind can blow this way and then blow the other way. You may prefer that it blow this way, but it's going to blow the other way as well, and you don't prefer that. So you have to give up your preferences in that sense. But I think the wind here means, and as Dogen goes on to explain, the actualization of Buddha Dharma is like this, the wind of Buddha's house. So look at what the wind of Buddha's house is. Buddha was 2,500 years ago, and that wind is still blowing. And it brings forth the gold of the earth, makes fragrant the cream of the long river, which is the Milky Way. So you can look at the motion even of the galactic, celestial bodies as wind. It's movement. And the wind of Buddha's house is what is pointing at reality. So the wind of Buddha's house is still blowing and bringing forth the gold of the earth. Gold is typically symbolic of enlightenment or awakening. So I think he means wind in a very universal sense, not just air.
sort of movement in general.
Movement.
So movement creates reality.
Yeah, the way we recite them, it says, wind moves, fire heats, right? Wind moves, earth is solid, water wets. And so if you think of, again, a pre-scientific time, you see these elements at play. And they also had space as an element, and they had consciousness as an element. So metaphorically, everything that happens can be seen as the admixture of the four elements at work. And we're sophisticated now. We know there are plasmas and there are other kind of forms of matter and so forth in which you can't separate fire and wind and earth, and it's all, combined. But nonetheless, I think wind is used here in that very broad, universal sense. What we're doing right now, talking is wind. So sometimes a little too windy, right? The mighty. So we're moving the wind of Buddha's house through this dialogue. We're fanning the wind. But that expression, and Michael, did you have anything further on your question? Yeah. May you be well. You can have wind without fanning means you can have this so-called the wind of Buddha's house. You can have the gold of the earth and the fragrance of the cream of the long river, which is the Milky Way again. You can have that without doing any work. You can have that without fanning. You can have the effect of wind without fanning, without doing the work. So if we overcome certain problems that we have, and the reason we start meditating, we often use the peeling of the onion as a metaphor for it, because the outer layer are those first reasons, and when you peel them away, there you have another layer, right? You peel those away, there's another layer, so it keeps going deeper and deeper. The problem underlying the problem, underlying the problem, and so forth, until you finally get down to the root problem. This is why I equate Zen practice with design, which are both problem solving and problem definition activities. The greatest scientists define the greatest problems. A lot of scientists define trivial problems, and you can find solutions to those problems and make a lot of money doing it, maybe. But Zen addresses the singular, most central problem. So the wind of Buddha's house this is what it's addressing in this movement. We don't think of Buddhism or talk of Buddhism as a movement, but in a way you could say it's a kind of movement. It's not a rah-rah, get out in front of the parade type of movement, but it's been this subtle movement that's been going on for 2,500 years now, and before that, according to Buddha's own teaching. People had to wake up to this reality. How long has humanity been on the earth? How long do we recognize humanity? Hundreds of thousands of years.
Where do you define humanity, I guess?
Yes. So how many Cro-Magnon Buddhas were there? How many? We have Angan.
I'll start with a question and then a couple comments. The question for Brian is, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now? Well, Linda
Yes,
can hear me.
you're good. We can hear you.
Okay,
Over.
I don't know what Hojo's sitting there holding his ears for. Listen.
Okay, start over, Bill.
Start over.
Okay. First of all, the question for Brian, as a psychiatrist, can there be any action that is not self-motivated? Even what we consider helping other people, that's because it makes us feel good. Now that's a sort of, is that a true or not true, or how do you view that? Secondly, this idea about the wind and the waves from a more practical point of view, it's sort of like the ocean and waves metaphor. The wind is everywhere, but at the same time, it's not here. It might be peaceful, and on this guy, it might not be blowing, so you fan yourself. So there's two sides to this reality of the wind being or not being. Yes, it's there, but it might not be there for the specific. Third thing, Dogen, I believe somewhere in his massive writing, said Zazen is like using mind to go beyond mind. And this sort of ties back in, well, if everything's self-motivated, you really can't practice without it being in your mind. So that gets back to your koan stuff. The way I was taught originally, yeah, koans are preliminary to shikantaza. But it's to try to give you some practice in using your mind, as Dogen said, to go beyond mind, beyond the intellect. So start with question, Brian. One, can we have any actions that are not self-motivated?
don't think that's a psychiatric question, but I hear exactly what you're saying. I mean, I think from a practice perspective, I will tell you something interesting that probably is only tangentially related to what you said. But when you decide that you want to do something, like let's say, this is like the 3 stages of habit formation, right? So if you decide you want to sit and you start sitting, you get immediate benefits from that, and you're choosing to sit and you want to sit, and you start to notice, wow, it's kind of crazy up there, but you might get some benefit from it. But you decide that you want to sit. When you want to develop a habit of sitting, and again, this is like the 3 stages that go along with any habit. The second stage is you don't really want to sit at all, right? You don't want to sit. It's kind of painful. Your knees hurt. You just kind of see this wild, crazy carnival that's going on in your head. You don't want to sit anymore. But you've decided that you want to sit. So the second stage of habit creation is deciding that you're going to do it, even if you don't really want to do it, right? But to your point, of course you want to do it because you think that there's going to be some advantage to sitting versus not sitting. But when you get to the third stage of habit, you just do it. You don't do it because you want to or you don't want to. It's like brushing your teeth. For people that, I won't generalize, but you brush your teeth twice a day, it's because you just brush your teeth twice a day. You don't think about it and you don't think you're not going to do it, and I think the same thing is true with sitting. So the question kind of back to you is, when you get to that third stage, are you doing it because it's good for you? Or are you doing it because you benefit from it? Or are you doing it if it's a habit and you don't really think about it, and you're not doing it because you want to do it, and you're not doing it because you don't want to do it, I don't know how many double negatives we throw in there, right? But you're not avoiding it, and you're not craving it. You're kind of after craving and aversion, if you want to put it that way. The third stage of habit creation is after craving and aversion. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, there's got to be some reason in there somewhere, right? But I don't know. I'll throw that back to you. It's not a psychiatric thing. I just was trying to figure out why it was so hard to develop a habit of exercise for myself and for the people that I help. What is this? So I started looking into habit creation, and that's what I came up with. So.
Do you have a follow-up on that, Angan?
We can't hear you.
That's my fault.
Now we-
I'm sorry. You can take that back into the subconscious. You develop this habit. It's still in your consciousness, but now you're just not aware of it. So you haven't really escaped your mind in doing something just for no reason, but the reason's down there, but you're just not conscious of it.
Take a breath.
Sorry, I guess we're having a conversation now. I don't mean to cut everybody else out, but I think at some point there's a Venn diagram that starts to overlap with the discussion of karma here, right? You start to develop habit patterns, and karma basically to me is habit patterns that we develop, right? And it's actions, right? But it's habit patterns, and we're sort of driven by this wind that's behind us, right? That we've created in the moment, and kind of back to that whole, it's beyond steps 1, 2, and 3, but yeah, it overlaps a little bit.
Thank you for your teaching.
A useful analogy to remember is the 5 skandhas, form, feeling, thought, impulse, consciousness, or variously translated. That the 4th one, impulse or motivation, etc., desire sometimes, that's the category that we're talking about. Why am I doing this? Why would I do this? Do I do this for myself or for others? That's all in the 4th skandha of all the underlying impulses and motives. And in the way this is expressed in the Shurangama Sutra, we kind of transition through those gradually over time. We all start out sitting in this kind of form or appearance in the material world, but we segue into sensation and into perception only, and finally into formations, mental formations. So all these questions come up. As Brian is indicating, we get to a certain point of accomplishment in our practice, and we may feel like that's it, that's all that's going to happen here. And so we give up, we quit too soon. But when you're in the skandha of formations, all of these issues come up as to why you're doing it. And ultimately, as you transcend the skandha formations, you don't really have any reason for doing this. And if you can go all the way back to Bodhidharma, he said, you don't have to do zazen. All you have to do is grasp the vital principle. So you have to figure out, well, then why do we do zazen? And as I say, it's mostly ignorance. We're trying to divest ourselves of our own ignorance. And it just takes time. It takes time and effort. And one level of ignorance is that level of complacency where you think you know all there is to know about zazen now. You've completed the cycle and you're not even close. You know.
I don't know where the teaching ends and begins, but thank you for your teaching.
Never ending.
Anyone else?
As I said, the onus is on us. You need to come to this. What if, did you ever attend a class where you never had to ask or answer any questions? You know, and you're just there watching the class. Yeah, certificate, yeah. You just sit and observe. Yeah, yeah. Not a spectator sport, guys. You don't have to talk about the koan I brought up. There's Lindy.
Morning. I thought about it a little bit differently, and maybe it sort of fits in with some of what Brian was saying, in that I think of the wind as Buddhahood or becoming enlightened, and the fact that it's there, it's already there, it's already in you. But then the fanning is the zazen, is the practice. It's the stirring up of that energy, so that you can experience it and see it and perceive it even. That's all.
Are we still muted? Okay. So the fanning, I think the closest reference is the sitting. In Dogen's case, you know, if you can have wind without fanning, that means you think you can be enlightened without practice. Now, sitting is arbitrary, and to the degree that you cannot establish a causal relationship between actually sitting in zazen and having some sort of insight experience. There's a statistical correlation over the centuries, a really big statistical correlation, that all of the ancestors in the Zen lineage practice zazen diligently. I don't know, there's the only exception that I know of in history is Huineng, and that was only up until his mid-20s when he had his first enlightenment experience. After that, he practiced zazen to clarify the matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to understand why we practice zazen in that sense. Is she wanting? Lindy, did you want to come back?
I just had that comment. Thank you for your teaching.
Seen the gold of the earth coming from the wind from Buddha's house. Maybe it's not visible. So John, you usually have something to say. We've lost two people. I guess we're not going anywhere with this dialogue.
Thank you, Hojo. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. What I continue to sit with, and for Brian, the psychologist, I'll label it cognitive dissonance. I had a professor who called it being two-headed. When I was younger, he said, sometimes you just got to be two-headed. What I continue to sit with, Hojo, is this experience of restlessness, wanting to be moving mentally, cognitively, but physically, wanting to be different, experiencing not quite there, and all of that. And then at the same time, when I sit and calm down and just open, there's nothing missing. And it's perfect, just like it is.
Respond to that? Okay, I think I'm on. Can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, I think it was Khalil Gibran said something like, when you speak, it is silent. When you're silent, it speaks. So you can apply the same thing to motion. When you are moving, when you move, it is still. When you are still, it moves. So it posits this, it takes advantage of the separation of self and other to get to a point. So this morning I was sitting in my usual seat over next to the altar. The incense from the Manjusri altar was burning, and it was apparently drifting in that direction across in front of me toward the window, and the window happened to have sunlight coming in from the rising sun. And so I could see this sort of beautiful mist of incense smoke that was just sort of hanging midway in the air. This is about an 8-foot ceiling, so it was about at 4 feet. And it looked like it was moving very, very gradually to the left toward the window, as if the circulation of the room were like that. And the fan was on, the furnace fan. The ceiling fans were not on. They would have probably made it impossible to see. There would have been so much movement in the air. But there was just slight movement, and it looked like it was just sort of hanging there in the air. And then it was sort of curling in and eddying in on itself. You could see this sort of beautiful pattern that was forming. So it made me think of Dogen's mother's funeral, where he was said to have seen the incense smoke rising in the temple at her funeral. He was only 7 years old. And that came to symbolize impermanence for him. So if you can also correlate, in other words, you can correlate movement and impermanence. You can literally see impermanence when you witness movement. That is impermanence. Another example is the after image. If you're sitting in Zazen, sitting very still for long periods of time, dark areas start to shimmer and become light. They'll even change color. You know, red registers green if you look at a white wall, etc. Everybody's familiar with the after image. But what the after image is triggering is the movement of time. You're seeing the past immediate moment in the visual cortex, or the visual spectrum at least, layered over the immediate present moment. So the after image is time moving on a different frequency, so it is also wind. The wind, breath of life, somebody mentioned earlier, Joseph, I think. The breath of life is this wind, and it's not permanent. But wind is permanent. We lost somebody else. I'm going to start tracking who leaves and why, and I'm going to get them on the phone and give them hell. What do you think? You're enlightened? You can leave? How about you, Joe Mendez?
Good morning, everybody. A lot of comments. I won't talk too much, although I do tend to ramble a little bit. To Ungan's question about good and why we do it, my anthropology training would tell me that the things that we do we do for ourselves to some extent, but also for the benefit of our culture, our society, or for the norms or mores that are, embedded within us. And if you've ever grown up in a particular culture and then left that culture voluntarily or involuntarily and had to make some serious changes to how you interacted with your society, then you might feel that clash of having to do things differently, as I did when we moved from my native Puerto Rico to the United States, which brings me to memories of growing up in Roman Catholic churches on very, very hot Sunday mornings in Puerto Rico, folding the weekly handouts into fans and fanning ourselves like the koan. And you can despair about the heat, and you can, get really desperate about trying to fan yourself or get up and leave, or, but in the end, the easiest thing to do was to just settle into it. And if you fan yourself, and if you don't, you don't. It might move a little bit of air, but it makes me think of my experience teaching and having students, think philosophically so much about a question or an issue that they take themselves completely out of the subject. So you may be talking about, something having to do with anthropology or history or martial arts, which I taught a little bit of too. And that student says, oh, well, wait a minute. Now, if this is this and that is that, and they try to come up with some analogy or algorithm, not necessarily to fool you, but just that's the way they think. And that's what I think about this student sitting before the teacher in this koan, just trying to say, well, like the question of why we practice, and some good advice that I got in my limited experience with Rinzai was to always think of the koan as a real exchange, not allegorical and not philosophical, but two real people with real question and perhaps a real answer. And so this student really wants to know, there's the air, and there's me, and there's you, and the teacher, I think, answers in a way to try to convey the fact that there is no real me and there is no real you, and there is air, but there's not air. And in the end, if I'm actualized with all things, then I'm actualized with the air and the fan and the heat on Sunday morning in church. And I fan because I fan, and I move the air, and that's all there is to it.
Let me come back to that. Maya? So I'll go back to Chi's original question where he was saying it's the air and not the wind. But I think in Zen it's always both. There is no separation of the physical and the spiritual. That is, there is a conceptual separation, which is real enough, but in an absolute or non-dualistic sense, they cannot be separated. And so the wind of Buddha's house is both the external air moving and the breath and so forth. It's all unified, you would have to say. So this question goes to, is there a true altruistic act? And scientists tend to have tracked altruistic behavior in other sentient beings, animals, so-called lower animals. And one of the concerns I have with science is it seems to reduce, especially in biology, it seems to reduce everything to a survival value. That every act of altruism, parent altruism, like a cat raising a possum pup or a raccoon pup, and then later kills it to show their kittens how to kill prey. I think that's a little oversimplified. Altruistic acts amongst human beings as well as amongst sentient beings. In the Buddhist model, if you want to call it that, there is no separation of self and other than self. And so in taking actions that benefit others, they do benefit us, but it doesn't simply reduce to that, in my opinion, and Ungan's point, it doesn't simply reduce to the fact that, no, all behavior is selfish, that's really the same dualistic view as saying all behavior is altruistic. Any further thing on that, Joe? Did I come close to addressing yours? You were saying in teaching,
Um,
coming from
well,
Puerto Rico.
you know, in the sense that sometimes I overanalyze and I try to go back to just the simplest thing. You know, if I'm hot, I fan. If I'm cold, I bundle up, or I don't. And maybe, you know, maybe the best thing to do is just to turn back to the wall and sit for a while with it.
You haven't. What do you have? Is it time? So I think it's time for us to close. Do the 4 vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Thank you for your patience in listening today. Joseph, if you want to follow up online, just get my email address. I'll be happy to respond.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Or, yep, Joseph. There's Joe and Joseph. We have a surfeit of Joes.